officers ruled the streets with unchecked authority, their badges a shield against any real consequence. Raymond Carter had seen their type before. Cops who viewed black men as targets, using their power to harass, brutalize, and bury the truth with fabricated reports and lost evidence. He had watched it too many times. Neighbors pulled over for no reason, friends humiliated on the sidewalk, and families torn apart by a system built to protect itself. But Raymond wasn't just another man to be silenced. A former Marine, trained to endure, fight, and survive, he wasn't going to wait for the next victim. He was going to expose the corruption, ensure the world saw the truth. Setting the trap was risky, but it was the only way. Hidden cameras, a staged encounter, undeniable evidence. It was all part of the plan. He would give them the chance to do what they always did, and when they did, there would be no hiding it. This time, justice wouldn't just be a demand, it would be inevitable. Before we continue, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Raymond Carter walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. A chill breeze swept through the neighborhood he had called home for over 15 years. It wasn't perfect. His street had its share of boarded-up windows, and the corner store he used to visit had closed months ago, but it was still home. To outsiders, it was a problem to be solved. At first, the signs were subtle. Police cruisers started hanging around, cruising past the block a little too often, slowing down when kids played outside or when an elderly couple sat on their stoop. Then came the questions. What are you doing here? Where are you headed? The tone was sharp, as if simply being in this space was a crime. Raymond had brushed off the first few incidents. After all, he was a Marine. He'd been through worse, but it didn't stop. It only got worse. Months ago, they'd pulled over his neighbor, an older man who ran a small cleaning business. They called it a routine stop, but everyone knew what it was. A black man in a van full of cleaning supplies was suspicious. The man's granddaughter had filmed the whole thing and it went viral. People were outraged, but then the attention faded and nothing changed. That's what broke Raymond. Watching his neighbors, his friends, his community suffer the same harassment with no real consequences. He'd been trained to protect, to defend, but here he was, letting it happen. That's when he heard about Lisa Tanner. A friend had told him about her, a reporter who didn't twist words or stop until she found the truth. At first, Raymond wasn't sure. Reporters weren't exactly high on his list of trusted people. But when Lisa reached out to him, she didn't sound like someone chasing a story. She sounded serious. She showed up at the community center where Raymond was fixing a leaky pipe. A petite woman with sharp features and even sharper eyes. "I've been hearing about what's happening here," she said. "I think there's a bigger story." Raymond eyed her skeptically. "A bigger story, huh? What are you going to do with it? Write an article that gets buried in the back pages?" "I'll do more than that," Lisa said firmly. "I'll make sure people can't look away. I don't just want to talk about what's going on here. I want to show it." Raymond didn't say yes right away, but over the next week, Lisa kept coming back, asking questions, listening more than talking. "You're the one who can help me make this happen," she kept saying. "People respect you. They'll see what's really happening if you're the one showing them." At first, Raymond resisted. "I don't need that kind of attention. What if it makes things worse?" Lisa's response was always the same. What if it makes things better? By the end of their last conversation, Raymond found himself agreeing. Someone had to do it. It was Lisa's idea to go undercover. "People need to see it," she said. "Not just hear it, not just read about it. They need to see it happen." Raymond adjusted his jacket and set off down the block. No turning back now. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He walked toward the upscale neighborhood, each step deliberate. The change in scenery came quickly. The boarded-up windows and cracked sidewalks gave way to neatly trimmed hedges and driveways filled with luxury cars. He passed a family unloading groceries from an SUV gleaming in the late afternoon sun. The mother glanced his way, her smile faltering as her eyes lingered on him. He knew the look well. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't warm either. The cautious, assessing look of the man on the porch hinted at suspicion as Raymond kept walking. He forced himself not to react. This wasn't new. He was here for one reason: to show the world what was happening. A few blocks in, the neighborhood grew quieter, with only the faint hum of a lawnmower and the rhythmic swish of sprinklers breaking the silence. Raymond adjusted his jacket, feeling the hidden camera pressing against his chest. Lisa's voice echoed in his mind. "Stay calm, stay natural." "Afternoon," a middle-aged man greeted from his porch, a newspaper tucked under his arm. The smile was friendly enough, but his gaze lingered a moment too long. Raymond nodded and returned the greeting. "Afternoon," Raymond said, his voice steady. The man tilted his head, his smile wavering. "You live around here?" he asked, trying but failing to keep his tone casual. "No," Raymond answered simply. "Just walking through." The man's smile faded, replaced by a tight, polite nod. "Enjoy your walk," he said, his tone noticeably colder now. Raymond didn't look back. He knew the man was still watching. He kept walking, his pace deliberate but relaxed. But inside, his thoughts churned. A police cruiser idled at a stop sign ahead. Raymond's stomach tightened, but he forced himself to look straight ahead. At first, the officers didn't move, but the longer he stayed on the street, the clearer it became. They were watching him. At the next corner, a second cruiser was parked on the side of the road. Two officers leaned against it, casually talking, but their eyes followed him closely. One said something to the other, and they both began to move toward him. Raymond's pulse quickened. He glanced around. Nothing but quiet homes and manicured lawns. He focused on his breathing, just like he'd been taught in the Marines. Stay calm, stay steady. "Excuse me, sir," one of the officers called out, his voice sharp. "Can we have a word?" Raymond stopped, standing tall. "Sure," he said. "What can I do for you?" The officer, a broad man with a square jaw, stepped closer. "We got a call about someone matching your description. Said you were acting suspicious." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? How?" The officer crossed his arms. "Just wandering around. Not from around here, are you?" "I'm just taking a walk," Raymond replied evenly. The second officer, taller and thinner, joined the conversation. "Well, we're going to need some ID. Just routine." Raymond hesitated, then asked, "Am I being detained?" "Not yet," the first officer said, a smirk tugging at his lips. "If I'm not being detained," Raymond said, his voice steady, "I'd like to be on my way." The officers exchanged a glance. The first officer's smile vanished. "Not so fast. We have some questions." Raymond clenched his jaw. This was the moment he'd prepared for. The moment Lisa had warned him about. The moment that would be caught on camera. "You don't see many guys like you around here," the taller officer said, his eyes narrowing. "Big guy like you, walking through a neighborhood like this. Stands out, don't you think?" Raymond's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. "I'm just walking." The shorter officer stepped closer, his smirk returning. "Walking? You mean waddling? Most people don't call that exercise." The officers chuckled, the taller one shaking his head. "You sure you're not just out here casing the place? Big guy like you must be looking for an easy target, right?" Raymond's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. "I'm just walking," he repeated. "Well," the shorter officer sneered, "maybe you should walk a little faster before things get complicated." Raymond didn't react. He knew the camera was rolling. Lisa would be watching this. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said. The taller officer took another step closer, now towering over him. "No, you're not," he said slowly, "but you sure don't look like you belong here." "Looks can be deceiving," Raymond said, his voice still calm. though his patience was thinning. "And I'm not moving." The officers stared at him for a long moment, the tension in the air palpable, like static electricity. They stood too close, their body language shifting from casual curiosity to subtle aggression. Raymond stayed still, his feet planted firmly on the sidewalk, his hands at his sides. Calm, controlled. He knew the camera was capturing all of it. "So you're refusing to cooperate?" the shorter officer said, his smirk turning into something more menacing. "I never said that," Raymond replied, his voice steady and measured. "I told you, I'm just out for a walk." The taller officer raised an eyebrow, dripping sarcasm. "Just out for a walk, huh? Dressed like that?" Raymond glanced down at his clothes. "Dressed like what?" The shorter officer grinned. "Nothing. Just looks a little out of place. Like you're not from around here." "I already told you," Raymond said, holding his ground. "I'm just walking through." "Well, maybe you should walk yourself back where you came from," the taller officer snapped. "You think these people want to see you standing around here?" Raymond didn't flinch. "I have every right to be here," he said calmly. "I'm not breaking any laws." The shorter officer shot back. "Your attitude is what's suspicious." Raymond's jaw tightened. He'd had enough. "I haven't done anything wrong," Raymond said firmly. "You stopped me. I'm just walking." The taller officer sneered, stepping closer. "Listen, buddy, I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I don't trust it. You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood, and you sure as hell don't act like you do." "What's that supposed to mean?" Raymond asked, his voice still calm, though his patience was wearing thin. "It means," the shorter officer stepped forward, "maybe we need to have a little chat down at the station. You know, just to be sure." "That sounds an awful lot like you're detaining me," Raymond said, meeting the officer's eyes. "And if that's the case, I'd like to know what law I've broken." "You've got a smart mouth," the taller officer muttered, stepping in closer, eyes narrowing. "Maybe you're not breaking any laws, but you're pissing me off, and that's enough to make you a problem." Raymond's expression remained neutral. "Last I checked, that's not a crime." The shorter officer laughed, though it sounded forced. "You think you're clever, don't you? Big tough guy with all the answers. Let's see how clever you are when we bring you in." "Bring me in for what?" Raymond asked, his voice calm but sharper now. "I told you what I'm doing. I'm walking through this neighborhood." "That's not a crime." "It is when you're casing houses," the taller officer shot back, his tone turning firm, deliberate, and dangerous. "Casing houses?" Raymond's voice rose slightly, incredulous. "That's ridiculous. I'm just walking." "We've got reports," the shorter officer said, his grin disappearing. "A big guy, black, matching your description, going door to door, trying to look for easy targets." Raymond narrowed his eyes. "You're lying. You never got a call." The taller officer stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Are you calling us liars, sir?" "I'm calling it what it is," Raymond replied. "An excuse." "Excuses don't land people in cuffs," the shorter officer said, his voice growing colder. "But keep this up, and we'll see if we need to get you down to the station for some questioning." Raymond's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not casing houses, I'm not robbing anyone, and you know that." The taller officer's sneer turned into something more menacing. "Is that so?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "I'm not robbing anyone." "Well," the taller officer said, stepping closer, "from where I'm standing, it sure looks like you've been hanging around a little too long. And it sure looks like you're looking for something more than just a walk." Raymond took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew the camera was rolling, capturing every word, every sneer, every accusation. But the air was thick with tension, and he could feel it rising. "I'm not robbing anyone," he repeated, his voice clear and firm. "And if you're going to accuse me of that, you'd better be ready to back it up with more than just your assumptions." The officers exchanged a glance. Their confidence didn't falter, but the lines in their faces hardened. They weren't letting him go. The tension crackled in the air. Raymond could feel the weight of their stares, the way they stood too close, their hands inching toward their belts. He didn't move. He couldn't afford to. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. "You don't seem to understand," the shorter officer said, his voice low and menacing. "You're not just going to walk away from this." Raymond's jaw tightened. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me exactly what I've done wrong." The taller officer stepped even closer, towering over him. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you? Maybe you're used to talking back to people, but out here, that's not going to fly." "I'm not talking back," Raymond said, his voice steady. "I'm just asking for some clarity." "Clarity?" The shorter officer barked a laugh. "You're in the wrong neighborhood, big man. Clarity's not going to help you here." Raymond stood his ground. "I'm not going to let you intimidate me." And that's when it happened. The taller officer's hand shot out, shoving Raymond hard in the chest. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't a light push. It was a full-force attempt to knock him off balance. Raymond staggered back, but didn't fall. His training kicked in, instinctively steadying his stance. "Hey!" Raymond barked, his voice sharper now. "What's your problem?" "My problem is you," the taller officer snapped, stepping forward again. "You think you can just stand here and run your mouth like you're untouchable?" Raymond raised his hands, palms open. "I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just standing here." The shorter officer smirked. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you mouthed off." "Mouthed off?" Raymond repeated, his voice rising. "I'm just asking you why you're stopping me. I'm not threatening anyone." "You put hands on me," the taller officer sneered. "You're lucky that's all we did." Raymond's jaw tightened. He'd had enough. The tension was thick in the air, every second stretching longer than the last. Raymond's shoulder brushed against a nearby lamppost, making it clear now. They wanted a reaction. They wanted him to fight back so they could claim he was the aggressor. But Raymond wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. "I'm warning you," Raymond said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Let go of me." The shorter officer pulled back for a moment, exchanging a glance with his partner, but then, without warning, he swung a punch. It caught Raymond off guard, grazing his jaw but not knocking him down. The pain was sharp and sudden, but it triggered something inside him, a switch that flipped. He didn't have a choice anymore. They'd started it, and now he had to defend himself. Raymond ducked as the taller officer swung next, the punch missing him by mere inches. He planted his feet, shoving back with enough force to create space between them. But the officers didn't stop. The shorter one lunged again, and this time Raymond caught his arm, twisting it just enough to make him yelp and let go. "Enough!" Raymond shouted, trying to maintain control. "I don't want to fight you." The taller officer stepped in again, his face twisted in anger. "Yeah, well, you got one anyway." The fight spilled out into the street, Raymond keeping his movements tight and controlled. He didn't throw wild punches. He used calculated blocks and counters to keep the officers from overwhelming him. It wasn't a brawl, it was tactical, almost surgical. His military training had taught him how to neutralize threats quickly, but he was holding back. He didn't want to hurt them, even though they clearly had no such hesitation. The taller officer threw another punch, this time connecting with Raymond's shoulder. Raymond staggered but didn't fall. He used the momentum to step aside, delivering a quick open-handed strike to the officer's forearm, forcing him to back off. The shorter officer tried to grab him from behind, but Raymond spun, breaking the hold and shoving him away. They kept coming. Every time Raymond deflected one, the other would attack. His breathing was heavy now, each move deliberate but tiring. He wasn't trying to win this fight. He was just trying to survive it. He had been trained for combat, but this wasn't war. He was fighting two men who had the power to make him the villain, no matter how much he tried to hold back. The taller officer lunged again, fists swinging wildly. Raymond ducked, weaving just in time to avoid a direct hit to his face. The officer's knuckles scraped across his temple, sending a sharp sting through his skull. Raymond clenched his jaw, his instinct screaming at him to strike back, but he stayed focused. "Stop this!" Raymond bellowed, stepping back with his hands raised in a defensive posture. "I don't want to fight." The shorter officer spat on the ground, his chest heaving. "You don't get to decide that, fat boy." Raymond's blood ran hot, but he swallowed the insult, forcing himself to stay composed. He backed up another step, trying to put more distance between them. If he could just keep them from closing in. The taller officer didn't give him a chance to finish the thought. He rushed forward again, slamming his shoulder into Raymond's chest and knocking him backward onto the pavement. Pain exploded through Raymond's back as he hit the ground hard, the rough asphalt scraping against his skin beneath his clothes. Before he could get up, a boot came down on his arm, pinning him in place. "Got you now, big guy," the shorter officer sneered, pressing his weight onto Raymond's forearm. Raymond gritted his teeth, feeling the strength in his arm as the pressure increased. The taller officer crouched down, his face inches from Raymond's. "You think you're tough, huh?" he hissed. "Think you can just walk through here like you belong?" Raymond tried to yank his arm free, but the officer twisted his foot, grinding it into his muscle. He bit back a groan, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing him in pain. "I didn't do anything," Raymond forced out. The shorter officer crouched, his smirk widening. "You didn't? Enough, fat boy. You should have known better." He punctuated the words with a hard punch to Raymond's gut, sending a deep pain shooting through his stomach and forcing the breath from his lungs. Raymond coughed, gasping for air as his body involuntarily curled inward. The taller officer laughed. "Not so tough now, are you?" Raymond clenched his fists. His vision swam for a moment, but his mind was clear. If he didn't do something, they weren't going to stop. He exhaled sharply and moved, using his core strength to twist his body, jerking his trapped arm free just as the officer's balance wavered. The sudden motion sent the shorter officer stumbling to the side, just enough for Raymond to push himself halfway up. The taller officer grabbed for him, but this time, Raymond didn't just block. He struck. An elbow to the ribs sent the officer reeling back with a grunt. Raymond surged upward, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The shorter officer rushed him, but Raymond stepped aside, using his opponent's momentum against him. The officer stumbled forward, and Raymond shoved him, sending him sprawling onto the ground. "Stay down," Raymond growled, his voice low and commanding. He was still trying to end it without violence, but he knew he couldn't back down now. They came at him again, the taller officer swinging with full force. This time, the punch connected, landing across Raymond's jaw. His head snapped to the side, the taste of blood filling his mouth. The shorter officer, recovering quickly, grabbed at Raymond's jacket, yanking hard. Raymond staggered, trying to keep his footing, but they were both on him now. The blows came fast, fists slamming into his ribs and arms as he tried to shield himself. They weren't just trying to subdue him. They wanted to hurt him. Another punch caught him in the stomach, then another. His legs buckled, and he dropped to one knee, gasping for air. The shorter officer grabbed his collar, yanking him up. "Not so big now, huh?" he sneered. Raymond could barely hear him over the ringing in his ears. His body ached, his vision blurred at the edges. He had tried to hold back, tried to de-escalate, but they weren't stopping. They weren't going to stop, and he had nothing left to give. The baton came down on his shoulder first, a brutal strike that sent a jolt of pain down his arm. He barely had time to register it before another hit slammed into his ribs. He gasped, his body instinctively curling inward, still trying to stay up. The taller officer snarled, "Let's fix that," and a sharp crack sounded as the baton struck the back of his knee, forcing him fully onto the ground. Raymond coughed, trying to push himself up, but the shorter officer kicked him in the ribs, rolling him onto his back. "You should have just gone home," the shorter officer muttered before bringing the baton down again. this time against Raymond's side, hard and fast. Pain exploded through his ribs, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. He tried to curl away from the blows, but the taller officer pressed his boot against Raymond's chest, holding him down. "Stop resisting!" the officer barked, his voice mocking. "I'm not." Raymond's words were cut off as the baton struck his arm again. His vision blurred at the edges, but he held on barely. Then came the weight, the combined force of both officers as they wrenched his arms behind his back. His wrists twisted unnaturally, the cold bite of metal snapping around them. The handcuffs dug in hard, too tight, cutting into his skin. Raymond lay there, chest heaving, pain pulsing through every inch of his body. The taller officer leaned down, his breath hot against Raymond's ear. "You should have just walked away." Raymond didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to. He kept his head turned to the side, his cheek pressed into the street. But he wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. They didn't know it yet, but the whole world was about to see exactly what they had done. Raymond lay still on the pavement, his body aching from the repeated strikes. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists, his breathing ragged as the weight of both officers finally lifted off him. His cheek pressed against the rough asphalt, the scent of blood and sweat thick in the air. He didn't fight as they hauled him up, his muscles screaming in protest as they yanked his arms higher than necessary. "On your feet," one of them muttered, pulling him up without care for his injuries. His ribs throbbed with every breath, his legs unsteady beneath him. The world tilted for a moment, but he kept himself upright. The officers led him toward the waiting squad car. The distant murmur of voices from a few onlookers carried through the air. A couple of people stood on their porches, watching. Some shook their heads. No one intervened. The door opened, and they pushed him inside. The seat was hard and uncomfortable. The partition in front of him smeared with fingerprints from previous arrests. Raymond leaned his head back against the seat, exhaling slowly. His body ached, his mind still racing through the events that had led to this moment. Outside, the officers spoke with another who had arrived late. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. Their body language said enough. Casual, relaxed. It was routine to them. The car pulled away, the flashing lights casting a faint glow against the darkened streets. Raymond stared out the window, watching the quiet neighborhood fade behind them. The roads were empty, the houses still. He wondered how many of them had seen what happened. How many of them had looked away. The ride was silent for a while, the occasional crackle of the radio, the only sound. Then one of the officers spoke without turning around. "Long night ahead." Raymond didn't respond. He had nothing to say to them. The station came into view, its harsh lights glaring against the night sky as they pulled into the lot. He braced himself for what came next. The doors opened and they pulled him out. The ground felt unsteady beneath his feet, or maybe it was just the exhaustion setting in. Inside, the station was cold and sterile, the scent of stale coffee and disinfectant lingering in the air. "Charges?" the officer at the desk asked without looking up. "Trespassing, resisting, assaulting an officer." Raymond's jaw tightened. "That's not true." The officer at the desk barely glanced at him. "Take it up later." They led him to a holding cell, the metal bars clanging shut behind him. The space was small, the bench against the wall the only place to sit. Raymond exhaled, lowering himself onto the bench with a slow breath. His ribs ached with every movement, the dull pulse of pain settling into his muscles. He rolled his shoulders, testing the strain. Across town, Lisa's phone buzzed against her desk. She barely had time to register the number before answering, her pulse quickening at the urgency in the voice on the other end. "They arrested him." Lisa sat up straight. "What? Raymond? They've got him in holding." Lisa gripped the phone tighter, already reaching for her bag. "Tell me you got footage." "More than enough." Lisa was out the door before they finished speaking. Back in the cell, Raymond didn't know how long they planned to keep him there. He didn't know what they would try next, but he did know one thing. Lisa had the footage, and once it got out, this wasn't going to end the way they thought it would. The cold from the concrete bench seeped through Raymond's clothes as he sat with his back against the cell wall, his hands resting loosely in his lap. His fingers tingled from the tight cuffs they had only just removed. The skin around his wrists was raw, the dull pulse of pain throbbing in his ribs. His body was stiff, but he wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. Every inhale sent a sharp sting through Raymond's side, and he knew that at least one of the strikes had bruised something deep. He rolled his shoulders, tilting his head back against the wall, staring up at the fluorescent lights above. They hummed softly, blending with the occasional murmur of voices beyond the bars. The station wasn't loud, but it wasn't quiet either. Officers moved in and out of the main room, some laughing at private jokes, others speaking in low, professional tones. The normalcy of it all twisted in Raymond's stomach. To them, this was nothing. Just another night, another arrest, another black man in a cell. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. His whole body ached, but the worst of it wasn't physical. It was the anger creeping into his chest, the frustration sitting heavy in his gut. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He knew getting stopped was a possibility. Hell, that was the whole point. But the way it escalated so fast, the way they went straight to violence, it left his hands curling into fists. They were waiting for it, he muttered under his breath, his voice hoarse. They didn't need a reason. His fingers flexed, trying to shake the stiffness. He needed to calm down. He needed to focus. He knew better than to let his emotions take over, especially now. One of the officers walked past the holding cell, barely glancing at him before dropping a file onto the desk at the front. Raymond leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "How long you planning on keeping me in here?" he asked, his voice even but firm. The officer barely acknowledged him, flipping through the paperwork. "Until we process everything." Raymond huffed out a laugh, shaking his head. "Process what? You didn't find anything on me? I didn't break any laws. You just needed an excuse." The officer finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "You can talk all you want. Doesn't change the fact that you're sitting in that cell." Raymond clenched his jaw, inhaling slowly through his nose. "I want my phone call." "You'll get it when we get to it." The officer smirked faintly. Raymond leaned back, pressing his lips together. He knew the game. They wanted him frustrated, wanted him to lash out so they could add more charges, keep him locked up just long enough for things to quiet down. But that wasn't going to happen. Lisa had the footage. The thought settled in his chest, steadying him. He had done his part. The rest was in motion now. Lisa sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her pulse hammering in her ears. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glow of her laptop screen. The video was playing. She'd seen a lot in her years as a journalist. Protests turning violent, leaked body cam footage, grainy cell phone videos of injustice unfolding in real time. But this was different. This was clear. This was undeniable. She leaned forward, her hands gripping the edges of her desk as she watched the officers surround Raymond, their postures tense before the first push, the sneer, the shoves, the way they circled him. Then the first baton strike. She flinched when it hit, her fingers tightening on the desk, even though she had known what had happened. Watching it unfold in crisp, high-quality footage made it feel heavier, more real. Raymond hadn't provoked them. He hadn't fought back. They had gone after him because they could. Lisa's stomach turned when the final strike sent him to the pavement. The moment the weight of both officers pressed down on him, the moment he stopped struggling, knowing there was no point. Anger, frustration, disbelief burned in her chest that this kept happening over and over again. Her phone sat next to her, but she couldn't bring herself to reach for it, not yet. She pressed play again, forcing herself to watch it from the beginning. She needed to be sure. The footage wasn't shaky. The sound was crisp. The words the officers used, the things they said, it was all there. No ambiguity, no gray areas. Lisa swallowed hard, exhaling through her nose. She reached for her phone, dialing a number with steady hands. It rang once, twice, then a voice picked up. "This better be important," her editor said, his voice groggy with sleep. Lisa didn't hesitate. "I have something. Something big." A pause, then his voice sharpened. "How big?" She glanced back at the screen, at the frozen image of Raymond on the ground, his face turned toward the camera, blood on his cheek. "Big enough to set the city on fire." Raymond sat in the holding cell, his head tilted back against the cold concrete wall. His body ached from the beating, the bruises setting in now, a deep, throbbing ache in his ribs and arms that made even breathing a chore. He had tried to adjust his position on the hard bench, but there was no comfort here. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the room. Officers walked past the bars without looking at him, their conversations low and filled with laughter, as if he wasn't even there. The wait was deliberate. He knew it. They were making him sit, making him stew in it, letting the weight of what they had done settle in his bones. They wanted him frustrated. They wanted him angry. But Raymond wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. The only thing keeping him steady was the knowledge that Lisa had the footage, the whole thing. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. He had been in worse situations before, had survived worse, but this wasn't just about him. This was bigger, and the city was about to find out just how big. Lisa sat in her car, the laptop balanced on the center console. The video was queued up on the screen, unedited footage playing from the moment Raymond entered the neighborhood. The entire interaction with the officers was captured in crystal clarity, the taunts, the shoves, the first baton strike. There was no room for misinterpretation. She had called her editor, given him the rundown, but she knew this needed to move fast. The longer they waited, the easier it would be for the police to control the narrative. She didn't hesitate. She hit upload. Within minutes, it was out. She pushed open the door, stepping into the cool night air. Her phone buzzed almost instantly. Her editor, reporters she hadn't spoken to in months, community activists already demanding statements. She ignored the calls. The footage would speak for itself, and it did. Across the city, phones vibrated, notifications lit up screens, and people paused in their tracks as the video began spreading like wildfire. Social media exploded with outrage. The footage was reposted across every platform, dissected frame by frame. The hashtag #YourJusticeForRaymond started trending within the hour. In Raymond's neighborhood, the reaction was immediate. Inside the corner store, a small crowd had gathered. The video played on a customer's phone, heads clustered around the screen. The shop owner, Mr. Daniels, shook his head, his jaw tight, as he watched Raymond take the first hit. "That man served this country," he muttered, "and look at how they treat him." A younger man beside him, maybe in his early 20s, scoffed. "Man, this is what happens when you go looking for trouble." He should have never been over there. An older woman behind them crossed her arms. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was trying to prove a point. And what did it prove? The younger man shot back. "That they're going to do what they always do," Mr. Daniels said, his voice low and firm. "That they can beat us down, lock us up, and nothing changes. It proves," he said, his words weighted with resolve, "that now the whole damn world can see it." Elsewhere, outside a local diner, two men leaned against the wall. One scrolled through his phone while the other paced. They didn't even hesitate, the first guy said, shaking his head. They were waiting for an excuse. The second man exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Yeah, and now we've got to figure out what we're going to do about it." "This is bigger than just one arrest," the first man muttered. "This is about all of us." Down the street, the doors to the church had been left open. The video played on a projector inside, a group of community members sitting in silence, watching Raymond's last words before the first baton came down. Reverend Harris, a man in his 60s with graying hair and sharp eyes, turned to the crowd. "We cannot let this be just another story," he said, his voice steady. "We cannot let this be forgotten." Some nodded, others murmured their agreement. Outside, a mother sat in her parked car, hands gripping the steering wheel as the video looped on her phone screen. Her teenage son sat beside her, watching in silence. "This is why I tell you to be careful," she said finally. The boy swallowed hard, but didn't look away. Inside the police station, the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Officers who had been laughing minutes ago now whispered among themselves, checking their phones, glancing toward the holding cells. The station chief stormed out of his office, phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp. "How the hell did this get out so fast?" The officer at the desk shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know, sir, but it's everywhere." The chief swore under his breath. "Where's Carter?" "Still in holding." "Get him processed now." Raymond sat up straighter when he saw the movement outside his cell. The energy in the station had changed. Something had shifted. The officer who had ignored him earlier now looked uneasy as he approached the bars. "Looks like you're getting your phone call." Raymond didn't move right away, letting the moment sit, watching the officer's expression shift. Slowly, he stood. Lisa had done her job. Now, it was time for the rest of the world to do theirs. Raymond sat at the metal table in the dimly lit processing room, a landline phone pressed against his ear. His ribs ached with every inhale, his knuckles still stiff from being cuffed too tightly. The air smelled like coffee and ink, the usual stench of a station where too many people had been processed before him. Lisa's voice came through the line, steady but urgent. "They just let you make this call?" she asked. Raymond exhaled. "Only because they don't have a choice anymore. They know what's happening," Lisa said. "The video's everywhere, and the pressure's mounting, but they're already trying to spin it." Raymond rubbed his temple, wincing at the lingering pain from the officer's baton. "Let me guess. Big black guy attacks officers? They had to defend themselves?" "Exactly," Lisa confirmed. "But it's not holding. Too many people saw what really happened." She hesitated. "And there's more. Someone else was recording." Raymond sat up straighter. "Who?" "A kid, high schooler. He was down the street when it happened, caught the whole thing from another angle. His footage is even worse for them. It shows the first officer checking if his body cam was off before they started hitting you." Raymond clenched his jaw. "That's a game changer." "It is," Lisa agreed, but there was hesitation in her voice. "What's the problem?" Raymond asked. "He's scared," Lisa admitted. "Won't give me his name. Says he doesn't want to get involved. Doesn't trust the police to leave him alone if they find out he filmed it." Raymond leaned back in his chair, the chain on his cuffs rattling slightly. He understood the fear. A kid with footage like that had every reason to be afraid of retaliation. "We need to protect him," Raymond said. "He can't do this alone." "I told him we can blur his face, keep his identity out of it, but he's still hesitant," Lisa said. "I need you to talk to him." Raymond exhaled through his nose. "Give me his number." "I don't have it," Lisa admitted, but he agreed to meet with me. Said if I brought you into the conversation, he might reconsider. Raymond nodded. "Then let's set it up." Lisa hesitated. "Raymond, they're trying to turn this into a circus. Some media outlets are already calling you a repeat offender, even though you've never been arrested before." "Doesn't surprise me," he said. "They'll do anything to make me the bad guy." "They've got officers saying you resisted arrest," Lisa added, "that you were aggressive." Raymond let out a bitter chuckle. "The footage proves otherwise." "Yeah," Lisa said, her voice tight, "but they're going to keep throwing everything they can at you." Raymond's fingers tapped against the table, his mind already working through the situation. "Then we keep pushing. We get that kid's footage out there. The more proof we have, the harder it is for them to rewrite the truth. Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, I'll set up the meeting. Just hold tight." "This isn't over yet." Raymond smirked despite the pain in his ribs. "It's just getting started." As he hung up the phone, he glanced at the officers lingering near the door. They weren't smiling anymore. Lisa's report was gaining traction. The footage was going viral, and now they had even more evidence coming. The truth was out, and the fight wasn't over. Raymond sat in the holding cell, his back against the cold cinder block wall, his wrists resting on his knees. The air in the station felt different now. Officers moved with less certainty, some avoiding his gaze altogether, others sneaking quick glances at him like he was a loose thread in the fabric of their power, something they didn't quite know how to handle. The video was out, and they knew it, but they weren't backing down. His conversation with Lisa echoed in his head. A kid had footage that could change everything, but he was scared to come forward. And now, the police were scrambling, not just to protect themselves, but to control the narrative. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and Raymond looked up as a uniformed officer approached. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was tense. "Carter," he said, unlocking the cell door. Raymond pushed himself up, his ribs stiff from the beating. "Am I finally getting my phone call?" The officer's lips pressed together. "Your lawyers are demanding your release." Raymond studied him. The officer sighed. "The DA isn't budging yet." Raymond clenched his jaw. Of course, he had expected this. The district attorney was feeling the pressure from both sides, civil rights groups demanding justice, and the police union closing ranks. "The whole damn country has seen what happened," Raymond said. "What exactly is the holdup?" The officer hesitated before answering. "The DA's office is considering additional charges." Raymond let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists. "Unbelievable." "They're not dropping this," the officer admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "At least not yet." A voice from behind made Raymond turn. "They won't unless they're forced to." Raymond's eyes landed on a man leaning against the far wall. His posture was relaxed, but his expression was serious. He looked to be in his 50s, with a salt and pepper beard and sharp, tired eyes. He wasn't in uniform, but everything about him still read like a cop. Raymond narrowed his gaze. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. "Darius King, used to be on the force." Raymond let out a humorless chuckle. "Let me guess, before things got bad?" King smirked slightly. "Before people had cameras to prove how bad it always was." Raymond studied him. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, who had tried to fight the system from the inside and lost. "You worked with them?" Raymond asked, with Hale. King nodded. "Long enough to see the damage he's done. Long enough to know he doesn't make mistakes. He makes choices, and you were one of them." Raymond exhaled sharply. "So what happened? Why aren't you still wearing a badge?" King's expression darkened. "Because I refused to look the other way." Raymond crossed his arms, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs. "Didn't work out, did it?" "No," King admitted. "I filed complaints. I pushed back. But the union always had his back. They made sure I was the one who paid the price." Raymond shook his head. "And now you're here?" King glanced at the bars, then back at Raymond. "Because I know exactly how this plays out. Internal affairs will investigate, but they won't take real action unless the pressure stays on. Meanwhile, the union's already circling the wagons, spinning this into a story about how you resisted." Raymond scoffed. "I didn't resist." King gave him a knowing look. "Doesn't matter. They'll say you did. They'll dig through your past, try to find anything they can use against you. If they don't find something, they'll make people believe something was there anyway." Raymond clenched his jaw. "I don't have a record." King smirked. "Doesn't matter. They've got plenty of ways to create one." Bitterly aware of the weight they were all carrying, But now there was something more: resolve. The officers had wanted to break him, to make him the villain in their story, but that wasn't going to happen. Not now. Raymond took a slow breath, steadying himself. So, why are you telling me this? What do you want? I want to help, King said simply. I've been where you are. I know how these investigations go. If you want a chance at real justice, you're going to need people who understand the system. Raymond studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, let's talk. King nodded back. Good, because if we don't move fast, they're going to bury this before it even starts. Raymond glanced at the officers lingering near the desk. They weren't laughing anymore. They were waiting, watching, hoping this would blow over. Raymond sat on the edge of the hard cot in his cell, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers intertwined. The minutes stretched into hours, and the weight of everything settled onto his shoulders. He had known this fight wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected it to feel this personal, this suffocating. His phone was gone, but he knew exactly what was happening outside. He was the story now, not the officers, not the system, not the brutality caught on camera. Him. The smear campaign had started fast. The police union had gone on the offensive, spinning the narrative into something else entirely. Raymond Carter, aggressive ex-Marine with a history of confrontations. The full story, they said. What the video doesn't show. Did Raymond Carter provoke the officers? They were doing what they always did, controlling the narrative, shifting the focus, making people question what their own eyes had seen. The headlines were relentless, twisting facts, digging for anything in his past they could use against him. And worse, they were going after his family. He exhaled sharply, his chest tight as he thought about his mother. She had called Dana in tears, her voice shaking over the phone. His mother had seen the reports. People had shown up outside her house, journalists knocking on her door, shoving microphones in her face. Some had even gone through their old social media posts, trying to find something, anything, to paint them as troubled, as flawed, as deserving of the treatment Raymond had endured. Dana had handled it the way she always did, head on, but she was exhausted, and Raymond knew it. The door to the cell block buzzed open, and Raymond looked up, expecting an officer. Instead, he saw his lawyer, Nia Caldwell, a tall, composed black woman in a navy blazer and glasses, her presence exuding the air of someone who had been through too many battles and still had plenty of fight left in her. Nia had been one of the first lawyers to take his case after Lisa's report went viral, and from the moment she walked in, Raymond knew she was the right person for the job. She sat across from him, pulling out a folder. "You doing all right?" Raymond let out a dry chuckle. "I've been better." Nia nodded. "The DA is still stalling. They know they can't hold you forever, but they're waiting to see how the public shifts before they make a move." Raymond's jaw tightened. "So they're trying to see if this blows over." "Exactly," Nia sighed. "And what's the union saying?" Her eyes darkened. "They're in full defense mode, saying the officers acted appropriately, that you were a threat, that they feared for their lives." Raymond let out a slow breath. "Same script, different name." "Pretty much," Nia said, her voice laced with frustration. "And they're using every connection they have to pressure the DA into keeping you here." Raymond shook his head, the frustration mounting. "And my family?" Nia hesitated for a moment. "It's getting bad." Raymond clenched his fists. "I need to see them." "I know," Nia said. "I'm working on getting you released, but they're playing games. We've got the video, we've got public support, but they're betting they can ride it out until people lose interest." Raymond's stomach twisted. "Lisa won't let that happen." Nia gave a small smirk. "No, she won't. And she's not the only one keeping the pressure up." She slid a folder across the table. Raymond hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were printed screenshots, messages, names, and stories. "I started collecting them as soon as the video went viral," Nia explained. People started reaching out. People from your neighborhood, people from across the city, all with their own stories about Hale and officers like him. Raymond scanned the pages, his eyes drawn to the testimonies. Black men who had been harassed for walking in the wrong neighborhood, parents whose teenage sons had been stopped for no reason, workers pulled over and searched on their way home. One message stood out, a handwritten letter scanned into the file. I was 15 when it happened to me. Officer Hale stopped me on my way home from school, said I matched a description. I was too scared to fight back when he threw me against the car, too scared to tell my mom what really happened. But I see what they did to Raymond, and I can't stay silent anymore. Raymond exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. They were just waiting for someone to come forward first. Nia nodded. And now they are. Raymond closed the folder, his ribs still aching, his head pounding. But for the first time since all of this started, something inside him felt stronger. They're not going to bury this, he said. No, Nia agreed. They're not. Raymond leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. He was still standing, still fighting. Chief Thompson stepped into the room, his posture tense, a phone pressed to his ear. He glanced at Susan with a tight frown, his voice sharp as he spoke into the phone. No, I don't care if it's inconvenient. You make sure Internal Affairs knows we need this wrapped up quickly. He turned to her as he hung up the phone, his eyes narrowing. Are we any closer to closing this out? Susan didn't flinch. She'd dealt with pressure before, but this was different. She had seen enough to know the truth was right in front of her, and for once, it wasn't going to be buried. She let the silence sit for a moment before answering. I'm not shutting this down, Thompson, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. Not until I've finished looking into everything. These reports, these cases, they're not just paperwork. They're lives ruined. Hale and his team have been operating like this for years, and now it's all coming to light. Thompson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. He knew better than to argue with Susan when she was like this. The pressure from higher-ups was mounting, but Susan had a way of making them realize that the truth couldn't be swept under the rug, no matter how hard they tried. I've seen what you're working on, he finally muttered, his eyes flicking to the thick file in front of her. But you need to understand, there are people above us who won't tolerate this dragging on. They've been tolerating it for years, Susan replied sharply, her fingers drumming against the file, her eyes hard. And for years, nothing's been done about it, but I'm not letting them get away with this anymore. Thompson didn't respond. He stood there for a moment, his gaze flicking between her and the papers in front of her. He knew the department was at a crossroads. They could expose the truth and risk their own reputations, or they could protect Hale and the system that allowed him to do what he'd done. Either way, the clock was ticking. You've got 2 days, Thompson said after a long pause, his voice low and resigned. After that, we shut it down, whether you're ready or not. Susan didn't flinch. She didn't look up from the file, her focus unbroken. Fine, 2 days. But I'm not stopping until I have everything. He didn't argue. Without another word, Thompson turned and left the room, the door swinging shut behind him. Susan sat there, the weight of what she was up against pressing down on her shoulders. But she didn't let it stop her. The fight wasn't over, and she wasn't going to let them bury it. Not this time. She picked up the file and flipped through it again, her mind already processing the next steps. The truth was there, plain and clear. She wasn't going to let them silence it. Outside the station, the protests were getting louder. The chants grew stronger, filling the air with urgency and power. Justice for Raymond, they cried. The momentum was building, and for the first time, it felt like they had a real shot at making something change. Raymond sat in his cell, his back against the cold concrete wall. The tension in the air felt different now. Officers moved through the station with an uneasy air, their casual indifference replaced by something more cautious. They knew the pressure was mounting. and they knew that the story wasn't theirs to control anymore. Raymond's hands clenched into fists, the pain in his ribs a constant reminder of the battle he was still fighting. But the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, and for the first time, it felt like the world was finally waking up to the truth. Inside, Nia was working her contacts, trying to push harder, to keep the pressure on the DA, on internal affairs, on anyone who could help. But she wasn't working alone anymore. The media was on their side. The people were on their side. And Raymond wasn't going to let them stop now. The fight was only just beginning, and Raymond wasn't going to waste this chance to make sure that the truth got out. He sat up straighter, his eyes hardening with determination. They couldn't stop him. Not now. His gaze fixed on the streets below, where the signs of unrest were becoming more apparent with every passing minute. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the importance of what they were about to do. This wasn't just about Raymond anymore. It was about a system that had let so much injustice slide for far too long, and they were ready to expose it. Ready? Nia's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to see her adjusting the files on the desk, her expression focused but determined. As ready as we'll ever be, Darius replied, his voice low but sure. Lisa, who had been setting up her equipment, glanced up from the camera. We do this right, and we force their hand. No more hiding behind closed doors, no more spinning narratives. The world's about to hear the truth from the people who lived it. Nia gave a small, approving nod, her eyes catching the light as she looked over at Lisa. Just remember, we have to protect them. These stories, these voices, they're the key to everything. We can't let the department discredit them. Lisa was already looking through her notes, preparing for the interviews. We'll make sure they're protected. We'll keep everything anonymous when we can. These people want to speak out, but we can't let the system turn them into targets. A knock at the door broke the quiet tension in the room, and Lisa motioned for Darius to answer it. He opened the door to reveal a man in his late 40s, his face weathered by years of experience in the community. His eyes were wary but determined. He stepped inside, nodding at Lisa before sitting down across from her. "Ready to share your story?" Lisa asked, her voice calm, reassuring. The man nodded. "It's time. Too many have suffered like this. You have to get this out there." Lisa smiled slightly. "We're going to make sure the world hears you." Back at the station, the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Officers moved with a different air now, uneasy, uncertain. They were no longer confident, no longer certain they could control the narrative. The video had spread like wildfire, and there was no going back. Every glance in Raymond's direction was loaded, a mixture of guilt, fear, and frustration. They knew things were slipping out of their hands. Raymond sat in his cell, his back against the cold wall, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs. He had been through hell and back, but the weight of what was happening outside felt heavier than anything he had endured so far. People were coming forward. His story was no longer just his own. It was the story of so many others, stories that had been buried for years, kept in the dark by a system that was supposed to protect them, but had instead served to oppress them. He was a symbol now, whether he liked it or not. His pain, his fight, it had become the rallying cry for a movement larger than himself. He had always known the fight wouldn't be easy, but now, with the world watching, with the pressure mounting from every corner, he wasn't fighting alone anymore. The interviews went on throughout the night. Lisa's camera captured the raw emotion of those who had experienced Hale's brutality firsthand. The stories were powerful, unfiltered, and real. As each person spoke, it became clearer how much had been hidden, how long this injustice had festered under the surface. And now, it was coming out. There was no turning back. The first few interviews were difficult, voices trembling with emotion, fear of retribution still in their eyes. But as the night wore on, something shifted. People began to speak with more conviction, their voices stronger, more sure of themselves. They were finally being heard. Back in the station, as Raymond sat in his cell, the reality of what was happening outside felt both surreal and empowering. The protests outside were still growing, the pressure on the department escalating by the hour. Internal Affairs was still digging, uncovering evidence that no one had wanted to see, and now, with the added fuel of the growing public outrage, there was nowhere for the department to hide. They were caught in the crossfire of their own lies. Raymond's chest tightened with a mixture of pain and hope. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under a system that had turned a blind eye for too long. The truth was finally out there, and it wasn't going away, no matter how hard they tried to spin it. He stood up slowly, the physical pain in his body a reminder of what had happened to him, but the emotional weight of everything was starting to shift. This was no longer about surviving the system. This was about changing it. His phone call was coming, and when it did, the real fight would begin, of reports. The weight of the moment settled heavily on her shoulders, but there was no turning back now. She had seen the case from every angle, heard every side of the story, and now the pressure was only increasing. The truth was out there, and the public wasn't backing down. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples as the sound of protest chants continued to reverberate outside. The pressure on the department was palpable. Internal Affairs was inching closer to uncovering everything, but the resistance was fierce. The police union was rallying, trying to hold their ground, but the momentum had shifted. It wasn't just about Raymond anymore. It was about an entire system that had allowed abuses like this to continue unchecked. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a text from Lisa, confirming another wave of people coming forward. More stories, more voices demanding justice. Susan's heart quickened. The city was on fire with rage, but there was hope too, real, tangible hope that change was possible. She glanced at the wall, where the photos of various cases she had worked on over the years were pinned up. Some had been resolved, others had slipped through the cracks, forgotten. But this one was different. The stakes were higher. And for the first time in a long while, Susan felt like the fight for accountability might actually succeed. In the small cafe, Lisa packed up her things, glancing over at Darius and Nia, who were deep in conversation. The stories they were collecting were making waves, but they needed more. They needed to get to the heart of the police department's corruption, and most importantly, they needed to keep the public's attention focused on the truth. "This can't stop now," Lisa muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. "We've got the world's eyes on us, and we can't let them turn away." King looked over at her, his expression calm but resolute. "You're right. We keep the pressure on. But we also need to be strategic. They're going to fight dirty. It's what they always do." Nia nodded in agreement, her brow furrowing as she thought of the next steps. "We push on the legal front. We get more testimonies, more evidence. We make it so they can't ignore us." Lisa exhaled, her fingers tapping against the table. "And we make sure they know we're not going anywhere." She glanced at her phone as it buzzed again. Another message from a witness, another story coming in. She glanced up at Nia and King, a determined look on her face. "We've got work to do." Meanwhile, in the streets outside the police department, the protests were only growing louder. The chants of "Justice for Raymond" echoed through the streets, growing in strength with every passing hour. The officers inside the department headquarters could feel it. The eyes of the city, the country, were on them now. But even as the walls closed in, there were still those who tried to protect the system, who tried to drown out the truth. Inside, Susan Calder was still at her desk, reviewing the latest developments, when her phone rang. She picked it up without hesitation. "Calder," she said, her voice firm. "It's time," the voice on the other end said. "We've got the information we need. We can't wait any longer." Susan sat up straighter, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I know. I'm on it." She ended the call and took a deep breath. The time for waiting was over. The truth was out, and now the department had a choice: expose the corruption or double down on their lies. There was no going back now. The pressure was on, and Susan knew she couldn't back down. This fight was about to reach its breaking point, and everything was on the line. The night was thick with tension as the protests outside the police headquarters continued to swell. People from all walks of life were joining in, demanding accountability, shouting for justice. They were no longer silent. They were no longer afraid. Lisa stood in front of her camera, the footage of the past few days weighing heavily on her shoulders. But there was something else in her gaze now: determination. This wasn't just about Raymond anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been pushed down by the system. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like the tide was finally turning, and friends coming together, their voices filled with relief and disbelief. The streets, which had long echoed with tension and fear, now felt alive with a new kind of energy. People were talking openly about what had been happening behind closed doors, about the officers who had gotten away with abuse, the broken systems that had allowed it all to continue. But this was just the beginning. The protests that had once been small and scattered now grew in size and intensity. Each march, each demonstration felt like a wave crashing over the city. The chants of "Justice for Raymond" grew louder, their message clearer. The truth, once buried, was now undeniable. Inside the precinct, the mood had shifted dramatically. Officers whispered among themselves, some in disbelief, others in anger. Hale's supporters, a small but vocal group, fumed about betrayal, but most were silent, knowing their time would come soon enough. Many of Hale's colleagues, the ones who had remained passive or complicit, began to realize that the walls were closing in on them too. The streets outside continued to pulse with protest as Susan sat at her desk, eyes focused on the files before her. Her mind was already working through the next steps, her resolve solidifying. She had known this was a fight that would push her to her limits, but she wasn't backing down. The truth was out, and she was going to make sure it stayed that way. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Nia. "We're seeing results," it read. "More people coming forward. We're starting to get the full picture." Susan leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at her lips. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were winning. The evidence, the testimonies, and now the public pressure were all on their side. They had momentum. She glanced out her office window, watching the protesters chanting outside. There was something undeniable in the air now, an energy, a feeling that things were finally shifting. The city was awake, and the people were demanding accountability. Inside the precinct, Hale's future was sealed. For the first time in his career, he found himself on the other side of the law. The cuffs bit into his wrists as officers led him out the back entrance of the building, his face set in a stony mask. No more power, no more control. No one was coming to his defense. As Susan watched him be escorted away, a small sense of satisfaction settled in her chest. But she knew it wasn't over. She turned back to her desk, flipping open a new file. Hale was only the first, but he wouldn't be the last. She would bring them all down, one by one. The city had been given a taste of justice, and now there was no turning back. The whispers of the past were no longer whispers. They were a call to action, and Susan Calder wasn't going to stop until every last one of the officers who had abused their power was held accountable. The fight for justice was just beginning. That told Raymond everything had changed. The energy in the room shifted the moment she walked in. There was no rush, no need for a conversation filled with legal jargon. Nia had a look in her eyes that Raymond knew well, a look that said victory was imminent, that this fight, for now, was over. "You're free to go," she said, her voice calm but with the strength that only came from knowing the fight had been won. Raymond's heart raced. For weeks, he had sat in this sterile, lifeless cell, his every moment defined by uncertainty. And now, those walls, once so unmovable, were crumbling, piece by piece. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from months of confinement, and felt a rush of disbelief flood through him. "Just like that?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Just like that," Nia confirmed with a nod. "The DA dropped the charges, all of them. The case is officially closed." Raymond exhaled, his chest tight as he processed the weight of her words. He had been fighting for so long, with so many odds stacked against him, and now it was finally over. He rubbed his temples, the sharp pain from his ribs still a constant reminder of the brutality he had endured. But now, that pain was tempered by a sense of relief that felt almost surreal. Nia stepped forward, her gaze steady on him. "This isn't the end, Raymond. This is the beginning. We're not just getting you out of here, we're changing the entire system." Raymond met her gaze, feeling the depth of her conviction. "And how do we make sure it sticks?" he asked. "By keeping the pressure on," Nia said, her voice resolute. "We keep exposing the corruption, the abuse, and we make sure the people behind this, every last one of them, are held accountable." He looked at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Then let's make sure they never forget what happened here." Outside, the streets were alive with a new kind of energy. The protests, once filled with anger, had transformed into something different. The crowd that had gathered was no longer shouting in frustration, they were shouting in victory. People stood side by side, their voices strong, their steps unified, as they celebrated not just Raymond's release, but the victory they had all earned together. "Finally," an older man said, standing on the porch of his house, arms crossed and eyes focused on the scene before him. "No more of them doing whatever they want." A group of teenagers, their faces proud and resolute, stood nearby. One boy, barely 16, wiped his eyes before shaking his head. "I thought they were untouchable." His mother, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "They wanted us to think that," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But now we've got proof. The badge isn't a shield against consequences anymore." Across town, in neighborhoods that had suffered the most under Hale's watch, music played from open windows and families gathered on sidewalks, sharing their stories. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now sharing openly, their voices ringing out with truth. No longer angry or mourning, they were hopeful. They were ready for what came next. Back at the precinct, however, it was a different atmosphere. Officers, once filled with certainty and pride, now walked in silence. The ones who had laughed at the complaints, who had turned their backs on the truth, now moved with a hesitation that had never been there before. Hale's reign of fear was over, and with it, the entire illusion of invincibility the department had built for itself was shattered. Susan Calder stood at the window, watching the crowd outside, her arms folded. "It didn't have to take this long," she said quietly, her voice laced with a mix of frustration and determination. Reyes, standing next to her, let out a slow breath. "I know." "This is just the beginning," Susan said, her eyes hardening. "We're not stopping here." Reyes nodded, his face grim. "I know, but this is only the start." Inside the precinct, as Raymond prepared to leave, the sound of the door unlocking pulled him from his thoughts. Nia's words echoed in his mind. He was finally free. But he knew, deep down, this victory wasn't just his own. It was for everyone who had ever suffered under the weight of a broken system, for the families who had been silenced, for the people who had been ignored, and for the voices that had been afraid to speak up. He took a deep breath, the world beyond that door waiting for him, and stepped forward. This fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The city was buzzing with a different kind of energy now. The air was thick with a sense of relief, of victory. The protests that had once filled the streets with anger now echoed with cheers, not for a moment of celebration, but for the beginning of real change. As Raymond Carter walked through his neighborhood, it felt like the world around him was finally starting to breathe freely again. The tension that had once hovered over the streets, like an unspoken rule, like a heavy cloud that no one dared to disturb, was dissipating. The usual stares, the suspicion, the quiet vigilance from his neighbors, it was gone. And in its place was something different, a sense of renewal, a sense of possibility. It wasn't just the absence of the fear that had gripped them all for so long. It was the feeling that they had taken back what had been stolen from them. Raymond's thoughts were interrupted when a young man, barely 16, stepped forward from a group standing near the corner store. "Yo, Mr. Carter," the kid said, nodding respectfully. "It's good to see you out here." Raymond smiled, offering a small nod. "It's good to be out here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. One of the others, adjusting his cap nervously, stepped forward and added, "You really did it, man. You took him down." Raymond shook his head, his eyes scanning the group. "We did it. All of us," he said, his words settling over them like a weight they hadn't realized they'd been carrying, the weight of what they had all done together. The young man who had spoken earlier hesitated before stepping forward and extending his hand. "I just want to say thank you." Raymond took it firmly. "Don't thank me," he said, his voice steady. "Just make sure this never happens again." The young man nodded, his voice serious. "That's the plan." As Raymond continued down the block, passing familiar faces, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in a long time. Mrs. Hendrick, who used to sit on her stoop every evening but had stopped when the streets had felt too dangerous, was back now. She smiled when she saw him, her eyes warm. "You walking different now?" she asked, her voice light with a hint of teasing. Raymond chuckled, a small laugh escaping his lips. "Yeah, I am," he replied, his eyes on the street ahead. Further down, kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalk, their laughter ringing through the air. They weren't afraid. They weren't worried about being stopped for no reason. Their freedom, once a fragile thing, now felt real. It felt earned. Raymond turned onto his own street, the familiar sight of his mother's house coming into view. The porch light flickered on as the sun dipped lower in the sky. There she was, just like every other evening, waiting for him. She smiled when she saw him, her face soft but full of knowing. "Took your time, huh?" she said, a hint of playfulness in her voice. Raymond shrugged, his gaze sweeping over the street. "Had to take it all in." Dana studied him for a moment before nodding. "Feels different, doesn't it?" He looked out at the street, at the neighborhood that had once felt like a battlefield, where fear and uncertainty had ruled. But now, people were living again. They weren't just existing. They were breathing freely, reclaiming their space. "Yeah," Raymond said, exhaling slowly. "It does." His mother stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes softened when they landed on him. "Come inside, baby. Dinner's almost ready." Raymond smiled, feeling the warmth of home wrap around him. He climbed the steps, pausing for a moment to look back at the street. For the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't just his victory, it belonged to all of them. And as he stepped inside, surrounded by the love and warmth of family, he knew this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer impossible. For the first time in a long time, change felt real. Thank you for reading. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I've also handpicked 2 stories I think you'll enjoy. Have a great day.